Hey, it's David, and welcome to Moto Mirius. Today we're doing a quick change of the rear brake pads on the 650 ABS Bandit, so let's get into it. You can see I've taken the slip-on off the exhaust so that we can see what's going on. You don't really need to do that, although you might find, depending on what torque wrench you use, you actually want to take it off or loosen it off so that you can get to this bolt here. Now, in the previous video I've done all the sort of stripping and cleaning of this. All I need to do now is to actually replace the pads. I would suggest check this pin out when you order pads, because very often you'll want to replace this pin when you replace the pads, because these do tend to get rusty. If the bolts and stuff are getting rusty, do think about replacing them. So let's get in. First thing we need to do is to get everything loose. So let's get the cover of the pin out. It's a flathead screwdriver. Make sure you get a really good fitting one, because if this hasn't been out for a while, it could be tight. Mine's okay because I've been working on the bike recently. Then we want to take our Allen head, seat it securely in there, and loosen that off. And finally we want to take this bolt out here. With that bolt out, we can now rotate the caliper up to allow us to get the pads out. Before we rotate this up, you might want to think about just unclipping the brake hose here so that there's more room for it to move. So if it tucks down the back here, otherwise it tends to get caught against here and you're twisting it at quite a sharp angle. So now we can take this pin out. And the pads are free to pull out. These aren't too badly worn when you look at it from the ends, but you can see there this one is got a lot more pad on it than this one. This one is always the one that's going to wear first, and you can see that that's just an uneven wear. It's not too bad here, but it's getting really thin at the top, so I'm replacing them. Next step is just to give the old pads a quick clean up, because we need to remove this stainless steel plate that clips onto the back. Along with the backing pad that's in there, and that's the same for both parts. I'll leave you to decide how much you actually want to clean these up, but you've got this sort of, I'm not quite sure what this is, formica melamine sort of shim here, and this is a nice bit of stainless steel, so that will come up really nicely with a brass or steel brush, preferably brass. You won't scratch it up so much. Bit of brake cleaner if you want to be picky, get it perfect. And when you're happy with them, take your new brake pads and refit. and we're good to go. Now on here I'm going to put a bit of anti-seize on there. You can see there's a bit of a wear mark, and it's supposed to stop brake squeal. Whether it does or not, I've never really been sure, but I do it anyway. Maybe that's why I don't get brake squeal. You don't want too much, you don't want it transferring itself to the actual brakes. Right, so what we need to do now is the hardest part, which is getting the brake pads back in. Now here you will see the piston is partly out, because of course the previous pads were worn. That means the piston's going to be out a bit. Now there's different ways you can get it back in. Now you can use something like a G-clamp or something in there and just push them back in. If your brakes are clean enough and you service them properly, you may be able to squeeze them back in with your fingers, but I've had no luck with this rear brake. So what I'm going to do is to use the same tool I used when I was cleaning them, and to actually push that piston back in. It's going to be a little bit fiddly. Bear in mind that if you've topped up your brake reservoir, pushing this in may cause the reservoir to overflow. So you might want to check to see if that's the case on your bike. Just move the spoke of the wheel out of the way. So just slide that in there. And push the piston out of the way. It's much easier to use this sort of thing than to try messing around with clamps and so forth, but use what you got. Now before we start to reassemble, what I would recommend is you get some anti-seize into this hole here. Because what will happen is the end of this pin will rust, and as it rusts it will seize into this hole. So it's a good idea to try and get some lubrication into there so that we minimize the risk of that happening. Again, it's always a problem with the brakes. They get really hot and they get wet and they get covered in salt and everything else from the roads, so corrosion is always an issue. Now again, you don't want so much it comes over your brake disc, but really that shouldn't happen. So with the brake pad piston pushed in, we can now fit our pads. Bear in mind as they come in, you've got these notches on the top. I'll try and keep my hands out of the way as much as I can, and the motion to fit these is sort of down and then up. Bear in mind there are springs in there, so got to fiddle it around a bit till it's just right, and that's the right place for that pad. As I say, you should have a spring movement on it. And this one goes in the same. So pin, through there, and again we want some lubrication on this thread before we screw that home. We're not torquing it up, just getting it seated. At this point the pads should be hanging quite free, and we can remove any excess grease that's come out the back of the hole. Now the pad's in it, and what you need to do is you need to push these back in and make sure they seat on the back clip here when they come down. You might also need to move this out the way. What you'll find if the pads aren't seated is that they'll come down and it will stop there. That's as far as you can go. But if you put your fingers under both pads and just lift them up at the back, make sure that's out of the way. There we go. And it will drop back perfectly into place. And now we can put our pin in. Again, make sure it's lubricated, because otherwise it will corrode and seize up. And with those back in place, don't forget to put your brake hose back under its clip. We're ready to torque these up and it's ready to go. But before we do that, what we can see here is that the pads are loose, the brake piston isn't pumped up, and if we go down the road like this, the first time we press the back brake, nothing's going to happen. So let's just pump it back up. Perfect. So we haven't forgotten to do that. Now we can torque these up. So the pad pin is 18 Newton meters. Which isn't very much. And the caliper mounting bolt is 23. Which again isn't very much. I would recommend definitely recommend some grease in here now, because this little pad cover you do not want to seize in, because it's only got that little screwdriver slot in it. All of these things are still available from Suzuki at this point in time, so you can order the new bolts, the pads, the everything you need is still available from Suzuki. Some of it may not be very cheap, but it is available. Previously I'd replaced this with a titanium pin. Now I'm not sure if this is a Pro Bolt pin or a cheap copy of a Pro Bolt pin, but it rounded out quite badly in here. When it sits in too far to actually get onto this actual nut part, so you have to use an Allen in there, and as I say, it rounded out, which is a bit of a shame because I do like titanium, but until I find someone who makes a proper pin, yeah, I'm not going to use that. So just quickly get in here, give a clean up of any grease that might be lurking around. And give everything a test. Make sure it's good to go. Check your brake fluid level, because if you've changed pads they will be sitting at a different place. That means your brake fluid will be up or down. When you've got new pads in here, the brake fluid should be sitting at the upper level of your reservoir. If it's not, then you need to add some more fluid, and if you haven't changed it for a while, you should be just putting a new fluid in. Don't forget, only put fluid in from a new bottle or very recently opened, because it's .4, it is hydroscopic, it will absorb water. But I say, if you need to top this up and you haven't changed your brake fluid in a while, it's supposed to be every 2 years, then change it anyway, and reference the previous video if you want to know how to do that. It's really easy. So that's it. Quick change of the rear pads on the 650 ABS Bandit. It's a really simple job, assuming your back brake has been recently serviced. If it hasn't, well, you might come into some issues with stuck bolts, rust, dirt, that sort of thing. But those are things I've covered in the other video, so if you're not sure, watch that. Don't forget to subscribe if this was useful or interesting to you. Otherwise, I will see you next time.